I would like to ask the next question to Dr. Raheja. Dr. Raheja, you have, for instance, worked with the government in the context of securing accessibility in India, and most recently, you worked on the harmonized guidelines that were released in 2021. So, as Mr. Baswaraju has pointed out, could you talk to us a little bit about your experiences working on universal accessibility and talk a little bit about what universal accessibility means? And why do you think that a shift to universal accessibility would and could operationalize accessibility in Indian cities, not just with respect to specific buildings, but entire neighborhoods and including last mile connectivity, for instance? So if you could just comment, Dr. Raheja.
Sure. Thanks, Sneha. Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
So good evening to all members on the dais, Madam Soumya Baswarajaya sir and the H.T. Parekh Foundation. So I think before I set out to say anything, I'm actually delighted to receive this report. And as I think already mentioned in my email, I mean, the title really touches me. I'm extremely, I would say, intrigued as well as compliment this word, because we use this very often, and you've taken it as a title itself, reasonable accommodation. And I think, this title itself says a lot, because I'll share with you another book, which of course we have authored recently, which is part of the national mandate. This is the Universal Design Guidelines, and they will soon be available to all of you online in a very short span of time as a PDF. We are still on the final tweaks of this editing, right? Now, the question that you've raised, Sneha, I know within this brief time, I can just touch upon a few pointers. And I always tried, as a designer here with my team, the first shift is in the language itself. When you say universal accessibility, the question is, guidelines have been there earlier also in 2016, right? You can take and have a look at it. So because I say that the book must speak through the cover as well. They sometimes say don't judge the people by the cover itself, but I would say no matter what, the cover is still a decisive force. So I think the entire story is communicated about India, accessibility and inclusion even on this cover. And let me explain this in a minute, because that explains the entire story of universal design even without reading this book. This book gives you an impression of a colorful image, which on one side represents pluralism of India, the cultural diversity of India, and also has colors which are staggered, which means they are not perfect. So, but imperfection is part of the perfection that you look at in, and you don't judge a colored line through a certain discrimination, right? And also on the other side, you see is the 9 dots, which represent 9 different forms of diversity. We are very conscious of the terminology that we are using, that these are diverse forms of human existence, which include disability as one of those challenges, right? In which you also have an expecting mother, in which you also have a transgender, and in which you also have elderly as part of the whole thing. And that sums it up in one small way, that this is what the idea of universal design is. So universal design is a shift from a barrier-free approach, which was very stigmatizing, despite good intentions, was focusing disability as a charitable approach, disability as a retrofitting-based approach, whereas forgetting, and why these whole challenges, which Mr. Baswarajaya also mentioned, is because I have to remind myself when I speak this, is the same construct which happened in Mahabharata that we heard of Yudhishthira and the others. When the teacher asked, have you learned the lesson? There was only one child, Yudhishthira, who said, no, I did not learn that to speak truth, I have to practice truth. While 99% said, no, we have learned the lesson. And this is precisely why the implementation is a challenge. Because either we say, no, we are law-abiding citizens, we are following the compliance, we are following everything, but we are not. Even by the book that you have seen and so many audits that we have personally undertaken, I fail to understand why are we accepting this violation. So should we accept the common citizen's ignorance as a matter of tolerance? Or should we accept the non-waking up of the legal channels to penalize people as an approach, or are we failing somewhere else? So universal shift is only a realization is that I am affected, because we are, let's accept this fact that we are self-centric civilization in the 21st century, no matter how advanced we are. We were far more community oriented earlier, but now with each one of us having an independent way of life, I think the accommodations are getting lesser. So in fact, when you say reasonable accommodation, I think we are becoming very unreasonable, even on our own dining tables. So unless, because the starting point is a social construct, the starting point is not the government. Then the second point here I want to say is the biggest shift is the language. The language is constructive, it is positive, it is reformative, and it is not negative, it is not discriminatory, and it is not the idea of welfare that I think the presentation previous to us said. Now, in these guidelines, if the question is what is new? So first of all, I must clarify this, the disclaimer, the guidelines were always there, the new revisions are also there, and huge shifts are also there. But the success of this will lie on the shoulders who carry it further. I take this privilege that I take this as a pledge to carry it everywhere, wherever I move, whether in the academia, whether in practice, whether in the mode of advocacy. But I wish that it is also carried by all others, and therefore it has been written in a way that even a common citizen can read this in a drawing room, on a mobile app, in a friendly way, and can rake those things. If I can just highlight to you certain things which this mentions. So it does mention that accessibility is not a static concept. It is not a concept which is one day, one time. It is a dynamic concept because it's a concept of services. So suppose your bus stand is accessible, but the buses are not running. So how would you say your transportation is accessible? So it has to be brought into the dynamic affair, and where services are very important, number one. Number two, it clearly states in the early chapters that the accessibility does not have one stakeholder as architect. It has citizens, it has persons, it has policymakers, it has everyone, including the service providers. So even if you're giving a tendering or a contract to a service provider, are you ensuring access as part of their mandate? So unless that is happening, even if you make a nice building, even if you put all lifts, the thing is that unless the services reach to the last mile and the last individual, access will not happen. And the third important thing, I think we've very clearly clarified that all typologies of buildings are included in it. Now, all does not need to be justified too much, but we have tried to put 17 building typologies in it, specified minimum compliance standards. But along with that, we have also written a statement that is a line within the lines, I would say, in chapter 6, which is that no building henceforth shall be approved for occupancy as well as for sanctions unless accessibility is complied with. Now, the question is, this guideline has to be enforced through the municipal authorities, through the development authorities. And this is where I think the response in continuation to the previous dialogue that you were having, I want to bring in two words, that unless we make this sector professional enough, we are still working in this sector in an NGO mode. We are still working that, oh, disability and accessibility, let's do a good service, lip service, and it's a very unprofessionally worked out sector still. And the second thing is there is no accountability for it. So I think these are a few perspectives. We have tried through these guidelines to bring that structure to it. We have tried to make it more visual so that people who may not even want to read a government standard book, so that it changes the whole notion of government as without color or legal as black and white to a very colorful environment, I hope. And we hope it can also be read as a light reading book for awareness for a multi range of stakeholders in order to bring the whole discourse of accessibility to each one's table and chair rather than to one particular sector of decision making.
Thank you, Dr. Raheja.